Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review a movie called Freakazoid. So, I know the view count or whatever of the first time that I reviewed this wasn't exactly stellar or something that told me that, oh, you need to keep reviewing this, but I actually just enjoy the show, and reasonably, I was like, well, I'm gonna just keep watching this and eventually hope that someday that viewership will come eventually. Because I actually really liked this show, and it kind of gets down to some points where it tends to go at some point. Well, viewership regardless, there's some stuff that I just liked, I just enjoyed, and eventually maybe people will find this and find this show and like it too. So with that said, we end up going through episodes 6 through 8. Really, we end up in this episode. Like, I think in the very first review of this, immediately was like, well, hopefully at some point we're going to get a real, true, legitimate Freakazoid, uh, like, actual origin episode. And surefire enough, we actually do get that here. We also get to have Freakazoid be a much more prominent character in his own show. We end up having it to where, yeah, there is little bits of skits here and there, but Freakazoid is more prominent within these episodes, I guess, because they probably just realized that maybe after doing the earlier on episodes, they're just like, yeah, but why are you guys doing so much of a variety? Like, you guys have a show called Freakazoid. Why aren't you doing more with this character? You can do more comedic, bizarrish things with this character, and like, why is this just bizarrely coming to be such a large variety going on in this show? Or maybe just after they shot like the early first X amount of episodes of the show, eventually they end up having like a Q&A department eventually going like, well, hey, why do you have so many varieties going on in the show? This makes no sense. And so on and so forth. So going on in this episode, in these episodes, we get an origin story of Freakazoid. We also get to really just have a lot of bizarrish fun with this character. Really, we are almost kind of uh, doing some things that I thought were really like really fun for me personally, because I actually liked a show called Quantum Leap, and every once in a while, I would mention said show, and I would kind of remind people about how much fun I would have watching that show, and so immediately we actually get a thing of Quantum Leap within this show. They can't. They try to they kind of joke around or skirt around the fact that they're basically copying and pasting that show, but they aren't actually going to call it Quantum Leap for legal reasons because they didn't want to get sued. I thought that these episodes were, at some points, there are some characters where I kind of thought I was like, this is a little, but there are also other episodes where I'm like, man, this episode was really fun. Like, it's kind of like, well, it's kind of like get whatever you can get out of these episodes, because there is this kind of heavy-handed thing where you're not going to like everything, but just kind of get what you can out of these episodes. So with that said, I think I'm going to get into almost just talking about spoilers, because reasonably, I've kind of already set up this character, and so reasonably, it's just kind of enjoy me describing these episodes because they get fairly complicated and they get fairly odd, and but on top of that, they are also fairly interesting. At least it's a lot easier to with the exclusion of knowing who all everyone is in these episodes, at least it's a lot easier to not have to jump around so much within describing these episodes, because reasonably we have uh, one story going on for a bulk of these episodes, which I actually thought was nice. I'm like, oh my god, like when originally I reviewed the first 5 episodes, I'm like, oh my god, this is going to be an arduous process to try to review this at first, because there's so many elements going on, there's so many stories, there's so many jumbling things around where I have to all know what all everything is. And like that was such a hassle and was such a thing to figure out. Where within these episodes, I'm like, oh, nice. A little bit of a like a pullback, a little bit of a like, whoa, wait a minute, like, hey, let's slow this down. Let's try to not be a million miles a minute, and let's just try to just put out some bizarrish, yes, but like quality episodes for people to enjoy. So, with that said, let's enjoy the spoiler aspects of these episodes. Again, I found the show to be wacky, bizarrish, and uh, just overall, there's some like give and takes with some of these things. Where I think like the World War II kind of episode is a little bit of just like why. Like I get it, they had to like I think they really wanted to do some kind of like time travel ish like element thing, but I also just like was like, why did you have to do the World War II thing? I was like, they could have avoided that. But with that said, I think it's about that time to go into the coveted time again. Spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil these episodes. Again, I'm going to go with the cheat sheet via these episodes, because recently I just found it a lot easier to describe these episodes. Like, whereas before, uh, like, really there was actually a lot more going on to where definitely I needed the cheat sheet, where this one was just like, well, like, considering the way of which that the first review kind of went and gone or whatever, I'm like, well, I'll just continue to use the cheat sheet. Like, if anything, like, there are some times where I just needed the cheat sheet because the stories were just so like there was a lot to review, or a lot of the shows like heavily complicated, like shows like The Tick were just very jumbling and confusing and whatever. Where in this approach, in this aspect, it's just like, well, like there's just a lot of transitions that where you have to completely understand or know any number of characters. So, with that said, let's go into these episodes. Spoiler time. So, uh, so episode 6 really is just our origin of Freakazoid. We have, for the most part, like an entire episode, really, or entire episodes really much more dedicated to Freakazoid and his origin, like story. And so we end up having it to where we have Dexter, who is to get this chip of sorts. It seems we end up having a Scottish man called Roddy McStew going into some business meeting of this company who makes said chip, and is saying like, hey, like, just letting everybody know that if anybody were to hit a certain kind of keys and then hit delete after that with this chip, they would end up getting sucked into their computer and become a superhero. And so we end up having Armada Gutierrez going like, well, hey, like, that sucks. Well, how about we kill this guy off so he doesn't reveal this ability for anyone to be able to do that? And how exactly would they have known how that exactly this chip happens unless they have tested it on other people? Doesn't quite make sense. So we eventually have Dexter, who is to end up getting this gift, uh, this chip for his computer, and so we end up having that. We end up having coincidentally that Dexter doesn't even hit the actual random amount of keys. That we end up having Dexter who ends up walking out of the room, and the cat ends up just bopping its feet onto the keys, and coincidentally that was the same combination of keys that would be the exact same key to, you know what happens. So we end up having Dexter who ends up seeing the code on this computer and ends up hitting the delete button, and that ends up sucking him into his computer, which then ends up sucking him back out as Freakazoid. So we end up having Freakazoid going into the bathroom to just kind of reflect upon himself to see who he is, and we end up having Dexter's brother Duncan going and banging at the bathroom to just like, hey man, I gotta go, hey, I gotta go, man. And so we end up having Freakazoid ending up opening this door and just wrestling Duncan to the ground, all while realizing like, well, Duncan has to go to the bathroom, and like this guy is just like wrestling him to the ground and doing all these kind of moves and so on and so forth. And so we end up having just Freakazoid just beating up Dexter's brother and so on and so forth, I guess, to get back at him for, I guess, being the family favorite or whichever. So we eventually have this Roddy Maxtu ending up making his way to Dexter's home, and so we end up having it to where we end up having Roddy asking Dexter's mother, like, hey, do you have any computer users in your home? And so immediately we end up having Roddy meeting Dexter. And so we end up having it to where eventually that it seems the only two people that know the actual combination of how to be able to get superpowers is both or just Roddy, and like Dexter kind of knows about it, but he wasn't the person that knew the combination because his cat accidentally hit it. So we eventually have Roddy, who eventually ends up getting to get with Dexter, and so we end up having that the Armado Gutierrez eventually goes and tries to retrieve both Dexter and Roddy, and so we end up having eventually the guy who ends up playing Gutierrez is actually the original Khan from Star Trek. And funny enough, we end up having Gutierrez consistently like saying lines from his Star Trek movie, like he tasks me, and then he yells out like Kirk, and then he's like, oh, that's a different movie. Like, sorry. Like, so like whoever these people were from the show, like must be just avid Star Trek fans, because we end up having like the whole entire fanboy episode where like they had like uh George Takei and Luke Skywalker and whichever. But anyway, so we end up going on and having Roddy make up the fact that that uh, Roddy is actually supposedly Dexter's driving instructor. Because at first he was asking him about Roddy was asking Dexter's mother about some chip, and then eventually Roddy mentions that he is some uh, like driving instructor for Dexter, and so we end up having eventually Roddy and Dexter getting nabbed by Gutierrez, and so we end up having Dexter's family also taken and being held hostage, and so we end up having Dexter's family going like, "Man, Dexter, how bad of a driver were you?" Like, man, like these people don't joke about how bad you are as a driver. So we end up having it to where eventually that they are trying to torture these guys for this information, and we end up having it to where they end up not wanting to give up the information, and Dexter is trying to figure out how to exactly to become Freakazoid, because Roddy is mentioning to him like, dude, you need to become like Freakazoid now, like you need to solve this whole thing. And so we end up having it to where Dexter can't figure it out, to where eventually uh he ends up just getting so uh just terrified and scared that he's like, well, hey man, like I'm really freaking out. And then all of a sudden he ends up becoming Freakazoid. And then we end up having Roddy eventually coming up with the configuration of how exactly to have Freakazoid turn from Freakazoid to Dexter and vice versa. To where eventually we have Roddy, who is to eventually decide to slip into the computer to cyberspace uh, because he wants to be able to correct uh, this whole problem to where it doesn't happen again. And so we end up having Freakazoid eventually taking out all of these guys and eventually uh, taking out Gutierrez. And so eventually we end up having Freakazoid eventually uh, going and having Roddy eventually telling him how to turn this Freakazoid thing on and off. And eventually we are to uh, kind of we'll just move on. I kind of really skirted around a lot of that episode, but it is what it is. So, Freakazoid in history. So, Freakazoid in history is to really just have it be that they really wanted to do some kind of like quantum leap like segment. We end up having it to where almost shot for shot, they basically copy and paste the quantum leap intro and place Freakazoid all in those moments. And so we end up finding out that it seems that Freakazoid had reverted some problem with a jetpack being strapped to his, or like a airplane propeller strapped to his back, and so we end up having bizarrely that Freakazoid ends up being caught into some time tornado to where eventually he is sent back to World War II. to where he is to prevent World War II from ever happening. And so we end up finding Freakazoid in Pearl Harbor, and he's like, well, hey, there must be some historical event that is going on in Pearl Harbor. And then so we end up having the Quantum Leap like segment of intro being done, and we end up having Freakazoid mentioning to people, it's like, well, yeah, like, if anything, we wanted to basically do this like a quantum like episode, but we actually can't say the entire title of the show, or otherwise we would get sued. And so we end up having Freakazoid going and seeing all of the Japanese fighter pilots flying their way with their planes to make it to Pearl Harbor. And so we end up having Freakazoid flying into the air with this plane propeller on his back, and he ends up becoming this border patrol for the sky. And so we end up having Freakazoid telling all of these these fighter pilots that he's like, well, hey man, like, you cannot pass this border without an inspection of fruit and all kinds of other condiments. And we end up having the Japanese fighter pilots going, wait a minute, like, he wants to check on our fruit? No! And so they all end up all deciding to all fly back to where they were. And so Freakazoid was like, well, I guess I figured that all out, and I conquered all of these people, and so on and so forth. And so really that is just kind of like the tail end of that. So we end up having a very next episode where we end up having to consistently try and say that the Freakmobile or the Freakazoid's like vehicle is to consistently be in place to try to make this vehicle as much as possible a thing that is going to eventually be a toy to be sold somewhere. It seems like they consistently keep doing this joke where they're basically saying that the vehicle of which that Freakazoid has is toyetic, which basically means a thing that is eventually going to be a thing that is eventually going to get merchandised out and so on and so forth. And to where there ends up being like an award given to Freakazoid for selling all of these Freakazoid mobiles and so on and so forth through this episode. So we end up having this villainous character called Longhorn, who is to seemingly have a menacing like vehicle that seems to be able to adjust to a number of certain circumstances. And so we also end up having to have this whole entire backstory of this Longhorn-like character that eventually ended up getting a Longhorn infused onto his body, and hence why they end up calling him Longhorn. We end up having, bizarrely, Longhorn having to also do this instrumental song of sorts, which I didn't quite understand why even do that. I guess to just stretch out time. So we eventually have, since Longhorn has this vehicle that is to try and help him to be able to get his job done, we end up having Freakazoid going and getting his vehicle, and he ends up finding a number of different of his Freakazoid vehicles, and he ends up going and grabbing one of the Freakazoid vehicles because it's the only one that actually does work. It's the only one that actually is operational. So we end up having it to where Freakazoid ends up via his vehicle trying to take Longhorn down, but eventually we end up having also Freakazoid uh, basically just easily crashing his vehicle and to try to get onto Longhorn's vehicle to try to take Longhorn down. And so we eventually, of course, as per usual, we end up having Longhorn uh, changing up his vehicle to where it lands upon some stadium, and so we end up having bizarrely that Longhorn and Freakazoid end up getting to this stadium at the exact time of the 7 inning stretch, to where they are supposed to sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," and so we end up having Freakazoid going, hey, Longhorn, you have to sing it. And so we end up having Longhorn singing Take Me Out to the Ball Game, but eventually we end up having Freakazoid changing the rendition of this to tie Longhorn up in ropes and to eventually have Longhorn get arrested, which kind of just bizarrely ends this portion of this scene. So the very next thing we end up seeing is this character called the Huntsman, I think it was called the Huntsman. We bizarrely end up introducing this character as some kind of like Robin Hoodish like man, and like he looks like a very much like Robin Hoodish like man in current modern time like detective ease kind of thing, and so we end up having this Huntsman going to this top cop to immediately ask, like, well, hey, like, what is it that I have going on? What's my next task? What's my next case? And so we end up having this top cop telling the Huntsman, well, hey, man, like, we're just like crime is really slow right now. I got nothing for you. And so we end up having the Huntsman just being all frustrated, and so he ends up taking his frustration out on some water cooler, and basically he ends up getting all wet. And recently, that's all they really have this character in all actuality do. Like, so we end up having this character who ends up getting put into this scenario. They end up building this entire guy up. They give him like an introductory like thing to let you know who this character is, to eventually have him actually do absolutely nothing because there's nothing going on, because like crime is slow. So that was just utterly bizarre, where it's like, okay, so when they actually finally do cut away to have some other kind of thing here, they just kind of skirt around it. And like, also, I just kind of thought it was hilarious how within these episodes they kept consistently having this like, we interrupt your broadcast for this message. Like, one of the messages, let's pause here for a second. Okay. Yeah. Like, that's a little bit new. Because, yeah, like, I would normally just, like, add all kinds of stuff onto this tablet, and then, like, I never had a problem with storage. But, like, I guess eventually, like, once you, like, put in way too much stuff into here, eventually at some point, uh, something's bound to get full eventually. So, with that said, yeah, I honestly just covered everything, so I think probably could have just called this a wrap anyways. And plus two, like, I don't think that I got anything that I felt that I needed to cover, or if I did, that, yeah. So with that said, yeah, another episode, another review done. I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.